The House Judiciary Committee room carried an atmosphere of mounting tension as Jasmine Crockett methodically walked through her assessment of proposed criminal justice reform legislation. The Texas Congresswoman had been presenting for approximately 15 minutes, drawing on her extensive background as a civil rights attorney to analyze how specific provisions would affect incarcerated populations and communities disproportionately impacted by the justice system. Her presentation combined legal expertise with compelling data about recidivism rates, rehabilitation outcomes, and the economic costs of mass incarceration. Committee members from both parties listened with varying degrees of attention, some taking notes, while others reviewed documents related to upcoming votes. Then Eric Swalwell, the California Democrat known for his media presence and prosecutorial background, raised his hand to interrupt with what he clearly believed would be a helpful clarification that would strengthen the case for reform. What happened in the next 90 seconds would leave every person in that committee room absolutely stunned and force Democrats to confront uncomfortable questions about whose expertise they valued and whose voices they were willing to hear. Before we examine this extraordinary moment that reveals critical dynamics within the Democratic caucus, make sure to comment where you are watching from and hit that subscribe button so you never miss these pivotal political exchanges that shape how our representatives approach criminal justice and legislative collaboration. Jasmine Crockett had established herself since entering Congress in 2022 as one of the Democratic Party's most knowledgeable voices on criminal justice reform. Her career as a public defender and civil rights attorney in Texas had given her firsthand experience with how the justice system functioned in practice rather than just in theory. She had represented clients facing everything from minor drug possession charges to serious felonies, working within a system she believed was fundamentally broken, but trying to secure the best possible outcomes for individuals caught within it. This background informed her approach to criminal justice legislation in ways that distinguished her from colleagues who approached these issues primarily through ideological frameworks or political calculation. Crockett understood the granular details of how sentencing guidelines actually worked, how prosecutorial discretion shaped outcomes, how plea bargaining pressures affected defendants, and how incarceration conditions influenced rehabilitation prospects. She brought this expertise to her work on the Judiciary Committee, where criminal justice reform remained a contentious issue, dividing not just Democrats and Republicans, but also creating tensions within the Democratic caucus between those who prioritized reform and those who worried about political vulnerabilities on crime issues. The specific legislation under consideration during this committee hearing represented a comprehensive attempt to address multiple aspects of criminal justice that reformers had identified as problematic. The bill included provisions reducing mandatory minimum sentences for certain nonviolent drug offenses, expanding access to rehabilitation programs both during incarceration and after release, limiting the use of solitary confinement except in specific circumstances involving genuine safety threats, improving conditions in federal detention facilities, and creating stronger mechanisms for holding corrections officials accountable when they violated inmates' constitutional rights. The legislation also addressed what reformers called the school-to-prison pipeline by investing in intervention programs designed to keep young people out of the justice system entirely rather than waiting until they had been arrested and charged. Additionally, the bill included provisions addressing collateral consequences of conviction, making it easier for individuals with criminal records to access employment, housing, and educational opportunities that research showed reduced recidivism rates. Democrats had been working on various versions of criminal justice reform for years, achieving some bipartisan success during the previous administration with the First Step Act, but believing that legislation had not gone far enough in addressing systemic problems. The current bill represented a more ambitious effort that faced stronger Republican opposition, but that progressive activists considered essential for addressing racial disparities in the justice system. However, the legislation also created tensions within the Democratic caucus between members who represented districts where crime had become a politically salient issue and those who represented constituencies that prioritized criminal justice reform. Some moderate Democrats worried that supporting legislation that could be characterized as soft on crime would damage their electoral prospects, particularly given Republican messaging strategies that consistently attack Democrats as insufficiently concerned about public safety. Crockett's presentation to the committee was attempting to address these concerns by demonstrating that the reforms in the legislation were actually consistent with evidence about what reduced crime most effectively. She walked through research showing that lengthy incarceration for nonviolent offenses did not deter crime more effectively than shorter sentences combined with robust rehabilitation programs. She presented data indicating that improving prison conditions and providing educational and vocational training during incarceration significantly reduced recidivism rates, meaning that investing in these programs actually enhanced public safety rather than undermining it. She explained how the current system's failure to adequately address addiction and mental health issues meant that many individuals cycled repeatedly through jails and prisons without receiving treatment that could break patterns of criminal behavior. Crockett was building a case that the legislation represented smart-on-crime policy rather than a naive approach that ignored legitimate public safety concerns. Her presentation was methodical and grounded in both legal analysis and empirical research, reflecting her training as an attorney who needed to build persuasive cases based on evidence rather than just assertion. She anticipated counterarguments and addressed them directly, acknowledging complexities rather than pretending that criminal justice reform involved only simple choices between good and evil. This approach was designed to bring along moderate Democrats who might be skeptical about reform, while also satisfying progressive members who wanted bold action. Crockett's credibility on these issues came from her lived experience working within the justice system, giving her insights that colleagues who had only studied these issues academically or politically could not match. Swalwell had served in Congress since 2013 and had built a profile as a media-savvy Democrat willing to take on Republicans aggressively on various issues. His background as a prosecutor in Alameda County, California, gave him his own professional experience with the criminal justice system, though from a very different perspective than Crockett's work as a defense attorney. Swalwell had positioned himself as someone who could bridge progressive values with law enforcement credibility, arguing that Democrats could support both police reform and public safety simultaneously. However, his prosecutorial background sometimes led him to approach criminal justice issues differently than defense attorneys and civil rights advocates who had seen the system from the other side. Swalwell had generally supported criminal justice reform efforts while also being careful to maintain relationships with law enforcement organizations and to avoid rhetoric that might alienate voters concerned about crime. During Crockett's presentation, Swalwell had been reviewing documents and occasionally checking his phone, not appearing to give her full attention. When she reached the section of her analysis dealing with prosecutorial discretion and how current practices contributed to racial disparities in charging and sentencing, Swalwell raised his hand and interrupted to offer what he clearly intended as a supportive clarification. He stated that, as a former prosecutor himself, he could attest that prosecutors generally tried to apply the law fairly, and that disparities often resulted from complicated factors beyond prosecutorial control rather than from deliberate discrimination. He suggested that the legislation should be careful not to unfairly characterize prosecutors as biased or to implement oversight mechanisms that would interfere with the legitimate exercise of prosecutorial discretion necessary for effective law enforcement. The interruption revealed assumptions about whose expertise deserved deference and whose perspective should shape how Democrats approached criminal justice reform. Swalwell apparently felt comfortable interrupting Crockett's presentation to offer his prosecutorial viewpoint, despite the fact that she had been systematically building an argument based on research and her own professional experience. The implicit message was that his background as a prosecutor gave him particular authority to speak about how the justice system functioned, perhaps more authority than a defense attorney's perspective warranted. This dynamic reflected broader patterns in how criminal justice debates often privilege law enforcement and prosecutorial perspectives while treating defense attorneys and formerly incarcerated individuals as advocates with limited credibility rather than as experts with valuable insights. Crockett paused her presentation and looked directly at Swalwell with an expression that committee members would later describe as combining patience with unmistakable steel. She acknowledged his prosecutorial experience and stated that she valued diverse perspectives on these complex issues. Then she delivered a single line that would stun everyone in the room and fundamentally shift the dynamics of the discussion. She noted that while Congressman Swalwell's experience as a prosecutor certainly gave him insight into how the justice system operated, her experience representing hundreds of clients within that system had taught her what prosecutors' exercise of discretion actually looked like for the people on the receiving end of those decisions. The observation carried devastating implications that rippled through the committee room as members absorbed what Crockett had just articulated. Her point was that prosecutorial perspective, while valuable, represented only one side of how the justice system functioned, and that defense attorneys actually saw more of the system's reality because they witnessed how prosecutorial decisions affected real people's lives. Prosecutors might believe they were applying the law fairly, but defense attorneys saw the patterns of racial disparity in charging decisions, the pressure tactics used to coerce plea bargains, the ways that resource advantages allowed prosecutors to overwhelm defendants, and the human costs of decisions that prosecutors could make without ever witnessing the consequences. Swalwell's interruption to assert prosecutorial perspective as authoritative had inadvertently highlighted exactly the problem that criminal justice reform sought to address, namely that the system had been designed and operated primarily by people who saw it from positions of power rather than from the perspective of those subject to that power. The silence that followed Crockett's response was profound and uncomfortable. Swalwell's face registered that he had not anticipated being challenged so directly, and that his attempt to be helpful had instead exposed assumptions he had not examined. Other Democratic committee members shifted in their seats, recognizing that they had just witnessed something significant about power dynamics within their own caucus and about whose voices they instinctively centered when discussing criminal justice. Republican members looked on with interest, some appearing pleased that Democrats were experiencing internal tensions, while others seemed genuinely engaged with the substantive point Crockett had raised about perspective and expertise. Swalwell attempted to respond by noting that he respected defense attorneys and had worked with many excellent ones during his time as a prosecutor. However, his response felt defensive and failed to address the fundamental point Crockett had made about whose experience should shape reform efforts. He suggested that both prosecutorial and defense perspectives were valuable, and that the legislation should reflect input from all stakeholders in the justice system. This attempt at diplomatic recovery actually reinforced Crockett's point, because the legislation had been built precisely on input from multiple perspectives, and her presentation had been systematically working through how different provisions addressed concerns raised by various stakeholders. Swalwell's interruption had not been offering new stakeholder input, but rather had been asserting that prosecutorial perspective deserved special consideration even when a defense attorney with direct expertise was presenting carefully researched analysis. The exchange forced Democrats on the committee to confront uncomfortable questions about their own assumptions regarding criminal justice expertise. Many Democratic legislators, particularly those from safer districts or with progressive constituencies, supported criminal justice reform in principle and believed they were allied with advocates pushing for change. However, they often deferred to colleagues with law enforcement or prosecutorial backgrounds when it came to specific policy details, assuming that such experience provided special insight into what reforms were workable versus what might be naive or counterproductive. Crockett's response to Swalwell challenged this assumption by pointing out that law enforcement perspective was not neutral expertise, but rather represented one particular institutional viewpoint that had often been complicit in creating the problems that reform sought to address. Defense attorneys, civil rights lawyers, formerly incarcerated individuals, and community members affected by mass incarceration had equally valid and arguably more relevant expertise about what was wrong with the current system and what changes would actually improve it. The implications extended beyond this particular committee hearing to broader questions about Democratic Party positioning on crime and justice issues. Democrats had struggled for decades to find language and policies that satisfied both their progressive base, which wanted transformative criminal justice reform, and moderate voters who remained concerned about crime and skeptical of approaches they perceived as too lenient. This struggle had often led Democrats to elevate voices like Swalwell's that could claim law enforcement credibility, thinking this would provide political cover for reform efforts. However, Crockett's intervention suggested that this strategy might actually undermine effective reform by privileging perspectives that were least likely to understand what needed to change. If Democrats wanted to pass criminal justice legislation that would actually address systemic problems rather than just making marginal adjustments that left fundamental inequities intact, they needed to center the expertise of people who understood those problems from direct experience, rather than constantly seeking validation from law enforcement and prosecutorial voices. The committee hearing continued after this exchange, but the dynamic had shifted in ways that affected how members engaged with the legislation. Democrats who had been inclined to suggest moderating various provisions to address law enforcement concerns found themselves questioning whether such modifications would actually improve the bill or would simply reproduce the biases that had created mass incarceration. Republican members who had planned to attack the legislation as radical and soft on crime found their arguments complicated by the substantive discussion that Crockett had grounded in research and professional experience. The hearing became more focused on evidence about what policies actually reduced recidivism and enhanced public safety, rather than on political positioning and stakeholder management. Crockett's exchange with Swalwell quickly became a focal point for criminal justice reform advocates who had long been frustrated by how debates centered prosecutorial and law enforcement perspectives while marginalizing the voices of defense attorneys and affected communities. The clip circulated widely on social media with commentary celebrating how Crockett had articulated a point that many advocates felt but had struggled to express in politically effective ways. Criminal justice reform organizations cited the exchange as an example of why representation mattered and why having legislators with defense attorney backgrounds brought different and valuable expertise to policy debates. The moment reinforced Crockett's standing as a leader on these issues and someone who would not defer to conventional hierarchies about whose experience counted as authoritative. For Swalwell, the exchange represented an uncomfortable learning moment about assumptions he had not fully examined. To his credit, he did not respond defensively in subsequent media appearances, but rather acknowledged that Crockett had raised an important point about perspective and whose voices shaped criminal justice policy. He stated that the exchange had prompted him to reflect on how his prosecutorial background influenced his approach to these issues and to be more intentional about seeking input from defense attorneys and affected communities. This response helped prevent the incident from becoming a prolonged intra-party conflict and demonstrated capacity for growth that earned respect even from those who had been critical of his initial interruption. The criminal justice reform legislation continued moving through the committee process with modifications that reflected the more substantive engagement that Crockett's presentation and her exchange with Swalwell had prompted. Some provisions were strengthened based on evidence she had presented about what research showed would be most effective in reducing recidivism and addressing racial disparities. Other sections were refined to address legitimate implementation concerns that emerged through careful analysis rather than simply deferring to law enforcement preferences. The bill that eventually reached the House floor was stronger than it would have been without Crockett's intervention and her willingness to challenge assumptions about whose expertise should guide reform efforts. The broader significance of the Swalwell-Crockett exchange extended to questions about representation and expertise in Congress generally. Legislative bodies function most effectively when they include members with diverse professional backgrounds and life experiences that inform their understanding of policy issues. For too long, certain types of experience, particularly in law enforcement and prosecution, had been elevated as providing special credibility on criminal justice issues, while other equally relevant experience had been dismissed as advocacy rather than expertise. Crockett's response to Swalwell asserted that defense attorneys, civil rights lawyers, and others who had worked on behalf of people navigating the justice system had professional expertise that deserved equal respect and consideration. This principle applied beyond criminal justice to other policy areas where Congress had historically privileged certain perspectives while marginalizing others. The incident also illustrated the importance of preparation and substantive knowledge in congressional debates. Crockett had been able to respond so effectively to Swalwell's interruption because she had thoroughly researched the issues, grounded her presentation in evidence, and understood both the legal complexities and the human realities of criminal justice policy. Her expertise gave her authority that could not be easily dismissed, even when challenged by a more senior colleague with his own professional credentials. This reality suggested that the most effective legislators were those who combined values and political skills with deep substantive knowledge that allowed them to make persuasive arguments based on evidence rather than just ideology or talking points. Thanks for watching this revealing exchange between Eric Swalwell and Jasmine Crockett that exposes critical questions about expertise, perspective, and whose voices shape criminal justice policy in Congress. This moment demonstrates how substantive knowledge and willingness to challenge conventional assumptions can shift legislative debates in ways that lead to better policy outcomes. Make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you catch every significant development as criminal justice reform continues moving through Congress and as these questions about representation and expertise play out across multiple policy areas. Drop a comment below sharing your perspective on this exchange and whether you believe defense attorney experience should carry equal or greater weight than prosecutorial background when Congress considers criminal justice reform legislation. We will be covering all developments related to this legislation and tracking how the dynamics revealed in this committee hearing influence broader Democratic Party approaches to criminal justice and crime policy. So subscribe now to stay informed on these crucial issues that affect millions of Americans and determine whether our justice system can actually deliver justice rather than simply processing cases.